Okie dokie. Hello, I am Sadhaka. Welcome to Circle of Spirit, Queer Questions, Sacred Answers. Today we have Julian, is it Crosson or Croissant? I'm just
It's Crosson.
Crosson. Okay, just making sure. Crosson-Hill, ICF certified spiritual life and business coach, human design coach. I really want to talk about human design today, and speaker. It says in your bio, you help gay men over 50 to flourish and step into becoming the mentors they never had. Part of what we've been trying to do here specifically is to get a space and a voice going for people within the queer community, within the gay community, a gay male community who are of a certain age, if I can say that. Just because there doesn't seem to be a lot of older influence, a lot of mentorship in the spiritual or in the queer communities these days from people who are a little bit older, a little bit wiser, and of course, bringing the spirituality aspect into it. It sort of seems like our community can be a little bit bereft of spiritual guidance. So I'm super excited to talk to you today. I'll just start with some background questions. Tell us how you grew up, what you're into, how you got into spirituality and that kind of thing. Maybe a little bit where you're from and your cultural background as well.
Yeah. Okay. That's a lot. So, and my stories, I've lived a lot of life in my 50 some years, so I'll try to condense it for you. So I was born in Indiana. I grew up in a non-religious household. My mother married at 16 to escape a fundamentalist parent. And so she wasn't into church at all, but I was fascinated with gardening when I was really young. And I remember my mother telling me that, that was God, like nature and gardening and the growing things and the animals, that was God. And so no surprise when I got to my teens and discovered Wicca and paganism, it just really spoke to me. I kind of had been primed for that. By my upbringing. So my father and I are like oil and water. So, had a very difficult relationship with my father. And so also I think that when I started exploring spirituality, the idea of a mother goddess spoke more to me than a father god did. Just because the relationship with my own father was so toxic that it was just really hard for me to get in that space. So, I started working in paganism in my teens, in late high school, went to the University of New Mexico as a fine arts major, and started the first pagan student union at the University of New Mexico in 1991. And so we were the first one there. There had never been a pagan group. There was, the Baptist Union and all of those things. And so we started the first pagan union. And then I mostly, I was involved in a lot of different things. I was out in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico. So I went to a number of the Beltane festivals by the Southwest Earth Festival Association, just really started to learn from other older pagans about how to facilitate ritual, how to facilitate groups, and then moved back to the Midwest in 1998. And I met Michael Lloyd in 2000 and went to my first ever pagan spirit gathering in 2000. And at that event, there were a number of us. So we camped in a camp called Rainbow Camp, which was the primarily LGBTQ camp at Pagan Spirit Gathering. And this was back when Pagan Spirit Gathering was being held in Southeast Ohio. And there was a group that had been talking about, wouldn't it be great to have this kind of vibe, right? But just for gay male pagans, right? Just like all gay men, like pagan festival, this kind of family village vibe. And, they'd been talking about it for a while. And, I'm a fire sign. I'm a manifesting generator in human design. So I'm a doer and not a talker. And so they were sitting there talking. And at the time that we were talking about it, I was really excited about this idea. The president of the board of the site where Pagan Spirit Gathering was being held at the time was walking by, and I said, "Hey, Charlene, come here a minute. We want to start a gathering. Can we host it here?" And that was the beginning of the Between the Worlds Men's Gathering. We held our first one the following year, and Michael and I co-facilitated it for the first 10 years, and then we passed it off to another group. And it's a fundamentally different gathering now, because I think, once the founders kind of leave, the group dynamic changes a little bit and people's priorities shift, because as a founder and a facilitator, you kind of put your mark on an event. So following that, I kind of, I was doing some things with my own community here in Dayton, Ohio. And then lately I've been mostly solitaire. During that time, I had a 30-year career in software engineering. And then around just before 2020, I got certified as a spiritual life coach and started working more like directly in like helping people connect to their spirituality, overcome some of their mindset issues, deal with some of the things that come up in life, and just helping people achieve their goals. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Like, there's a lot more, but like I said, could be here all day. I've packed a lot of living into 50 some years. So.
Sounds like it. No, I appreciate that summary. It might be difficult, I know, especially looking back, to really pinpoint a time in your life or like a certain feeling that you might have had. But what really made you like reach out and be interested in spirituality to begin with, especially coming from a non-religious household? Like, was it your mother and just like having that sort of little mystical, spiritual, thing with nature and so on? Or
yeah, so I think for me, like, I was always fascinated with the paranormal. I always knew there was something beyond what we could see and experience, like, physically. I was fascinated with, like, in third grade, I read everything I could get my hands on UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, all of it. I was just always fascinated with it. My favorite comic book was Doctor Strange, so I was super fascinated by the occult. And so I think really it kind of was, the interest was always there. It was just finding the right container for that. And so then when I started to hear about Wicca, and I was first introduced to Wicca by a friend who lent me a copy of Scott Cunningham's Wicca for the Solitary Practitioner. And so when I, discovered that container that aligned with a lot of the things that I had learned from my mother, just from like the way she approached life and my own interest in like magic and the occult, it just kind of was like, all right, this is the right path, and, kind of came together that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I had similar experiences. I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness. And so anything occult, anything mystical, anything magical was all demons all the time. It was all demons. It was all Satan and all of that. And yet, even as a child, I had this sense that there was something between the cracks, that there was something more, that there was power that I was supposed to have. I would try to like move things with my mind. It wasn't just because I watched Star Wars or whatever. It was like there's got to be something like this material things out there and objects. Like, I have this consciousness even at 5 years old. I'm like, my consciousness should be able to have some kind of power over that, So I think in some people it's just kind of innate.
Yeah, and Star Wars was definitely like a spiritual awakening for a lot of us. Like I remember seeing that in, like, I was like 7 or 8. And, the concept of the Force, I mean, like, really, in a lot of ways, Star Wars introduced like the world to Zen Buddhism in a lot of ways. And, so there were a lot of kids who were kind of going, oh, I should meditate. I should be able to move things with my mind. So yeah, Star Wars really was a big part of that.
Yeah, for me too, actually. It's not necessarily geared towards one specific earthly human religion or spiritual tradition or whatever, but it has elements of a lot of different traditions, and so for me, it sort of steered me towards Taoism. There's a lot of Taoism in the whole Star Wars mythos as well,
Yeah, and of course, George Lucas was a huge fan of Joseph Campbell and, his whole comparative mythology work. And so, of course, there's a lot of those themes of the hero's journey and, finding your bliss in Star Wars.
I've heard a lot of other people mention, I think it's Scott Cunningham, you said, the author of the first reading as an introduction to certain spiritual traditions or to Wicca or to paganism in general. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what was it for you? Did it like just, oh my God, this is the one, just open you up? Or was it just kind of like, all right, there's something here,
No, I think Scott Cunningham, and rereading it now, having been a practitioner for a lot of years, I don't see the same thing in it. But as someone first coming to Wicca and having like that sort of already curiosity and interest and everything, coming across Scott Cunningham's book and reading his words was really, Scott was very like poetic, and he really talked about the beauty of it and how it was all about love and pleasure. And almost poetically, and it just like his writing was very, very moving for someone who was looking for that like spiritual home. And so I think for me that it was like I read Scott's words and I was like, this is it, this is what I've been looking for. But once I like read his work and like went to some rituals and was doing some stuff on my own, then there was the part of me that was like, okay, I want more. I want to go deeper. Like, this is great, and I can sense the energy. I can feel the power in this, but I want more. And which is what led me to starting to explore like more of the occult and the OTO, and there was a magical order in Albuquerque at the time called the OAI that worked in a lot of like ceremonial occult type work, and I studied with them for a number of years. So if anything, like it opened the door and was like, yes, this is where I belong. But then it also like sort of pushed me to want to go deeper as well. Mm-hmm. And Scott was also a queer man himself. I don't know if you were aware of that, but he was a gay man as well.
Oh, okay. Is he the one who wrote Gay Witchcraft as well, or is that somebody else?
No, that's so there's two versions of gay. There's two books called Gay Witchcraft. One's called Gay Wicca, and one's called Gay Witchcraft. Gay Witchcraft was written by Christopher Pinzak.
Okay. Yeah. So as an intro, just like I work in. Oh, there's Miguel. I'll let him in too. So as an intro to different things like that, energy healing is where I really got it. And again, I was always obsessed for some reason with Taoist practices. I was always obsessed with Asian cultures in particular. I don't know why. I feel like it's a past life thing. I saw some people, I think it was like Shaolin monks, one of those old TV programs that we would watch, and it was like, look how mysterious the world is, and at least from a Western American perspective, we're like, what are these people doing with their weird martial arts type things, and I just saw them, they were doing Qigong, and then it was, back to a reference to like Star Wars or whatever, they were using Qi and focusing it like on a piece of paper, and they could light the piece of paper on fire. I was like, that's it, I'm done, so I immediately went out to the library and I started looking up books on Qigong. Still practice Qigong today. It's still a huge part of the work that I do. And just to depart from that a little bit, well, first of all, just a personal comment. Once again, I had to hide it from my parents because they would have thought I was inviting demons into the house. So I kept it in a locked box. Me just like trying to be a peaceful little monk kind of guy and just like doing some stuff to calm my breath and feel energy. Oh no, demons. Anyway, so that was like my path. And then it all of a sudden, when I started to be an adult and I got away from that, it was Reiki, So all these energy healing people were just talking about Reiki, and that was like the big thing. That I'm like, oh, this is a thing that you can do. You can have spiritual awakenings from it. You can work with this force, this energy. And a lot of people over the years have told me that was sort of their, what's the word? Their gateway, like their gateway drug into spirituality or whatever was Reiki. Now, all of a sudden, I'm finding people talking about that was like the training wheels. I'm ready for something more. Like you were saying with your intro to Wicca and all of that, it's like you realize that there's something there's something positive, there's something more to uncover, but then you have to take the next step,
Yeah, definitely. And for a long time, in the like 90s and even into the early 2000s, there was a lot of great stuff being published about paganism and Wicca, but it was all kind of 101 books. Llewellyn had probably, you could find 100 101 books, but if you had been practicing for a while and wanted to go deeper, you were kind of on your own. There wasn't really, Christopher Penczak and some of the people who were writing like deeper stuff and talking about like some of the deeper mysteries and how to like continue to grow. And so a lot of us were kind of like, we got into it through the 101s, and then we were trying to like find our way and figure out, okay, where do we go from here for a long time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that theme over the years. It's not like it is now, and you can just like type something into an AI GPT or whatever and have it list all of these different authors and all of this information, or do a Google search and find all of this free information. It was like, I was there when the internet happened for the first time, and nothing was out there. Like even way back then, there was nothing out there. I remember going to a bookstore once, and I think it was the gay witchcraft book that I mentioned earlier. And there was this kid, obviously a little goth, shaved head, black nails, that kind of thing. And he picks up the gay witchcraft book, and his parents were on the side, and his mom just starts hugging his dad. It's like, oh, it's so hard. How do we do this? Just accepting our son for all this. It was adorable. And I'm just like, okay, well, at least they're trying.
Yeah.
But just to shift the conversation a little bit. I always find it to be kind of a struggle. Some of the things that we talk about here when it comes to spirituality are universals. The entirety of Western civilization, I think, is lacking spirit these days. The entirety of Western civilization, scientific materialism, atheism, science, all of that, which is totally great for a certain level of consciousness and whatnot. And I'm a huge fan of science, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, I think that it's just left us very disenfranchised and disconnected from spirit. And so I sometimes struggle to separate that from what I want to talk about as far as queerness and spirituality, and how that type of thing, how spirituality in general, getting into ritual, getting into sacred art, practice, whatever it may be, can actually help people in the queer community, because I think it can help everyone, But just bringing that up, you've worked with specifically queer men in the past or whatever. What has come up for you? Just pick a couple examples maybe that you think people really can benefit from having a type of spirituality, from exploring this stuff, no matter what their chosen path may be.
Yeah, so I think for me, there's a few things that sort of stand out as like experiences or areas of life where I've seen spirituality really like have an impact. Or just really like where people kind of can connect it. So first of all is, this sense of purpose. And, like my interest that I work mostly in my coaching practice, mostly men over 50. And, 50 years is when the Chiron return happens in our human design chart, which Chiron is the asteroid of the wounded healer. So it's when all of our biggest woundings kind of come up, and it's like, that's our time when we transmute that to kind of become that healer that we were always designed to be. And I think that what happens is that, society has always talked about the midlife crisis. And, the whole search for meaning that kind of happens when we start to reach a certain age. We start to be faced with our mortality. We start to think about what our legacy will be. And, what is your purpose if you don't believe in that you're part of something bigger than yourself? Is it to make money? Is it to buy a big house? Is it to have a car? Is it to leave the biggest pile of cash behind when you die? Like, and yeah, atheists, they do things like social services and work and contribute to the well-being of people. But I think that having a sense of something bigger than yourself provides more meaning to life. And it's not just me, like, my coaching practice is also grounded in positive psychology. And Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology, when he put together the PERMA theory of flourishing, when he talked about meaning, which is one of the elements of flourishing specifically, he said that part of achieving meaning in terms of flourishing means realizing that there is something bigger than yourself, whatever that is, and it could be, it could be something secular, but he's found that in his work, most people who really find meaning in life believe in something bigger than themselves in a spiritual sense, in spirituality. So I think first of all, like, you know, when gay men reach a certain age, they start to really struggle with this sense of purpose and meaning and their place in the world, because gay culture is youth obsessed, and so our bodies are changing. Gay culture is so youth obsessed. We don't know really very well how to mentor other people, and we don't know how to be older queer men, older gay men, because all of our role models we lost to the AIDS epidemic. So we didn't grow up with those role models. We lost them all. And so we're forging our own path here, trying to figure out, what does it mean to be an aging gay man, and how can we contribute to the queer community, to the gay community? How can we share our wisdom? And of course, there's always been that thing in the gay community where if an older man wants to be your friend, it's because they're a chicken hawk or they want to get in your pants or whatever. And, that's not necessarily true. It's not always false either, but, and there's room for both, so it's just, for me, spirituality really comes into that purpose and meaning. Like, how do we create meaning as we age, and how do we think about our legacy and what happens when we're done with this life? I think the other place is in sexuality. The idea of sacred sexuality. The hookup culture has really turned sex into a transactional thing. When I came out in the 80s, I came out into a community around the art school at University of New Mexico. I had a group of friends. We were all different ages, from like, I was 18. Some of my friends were in their 50s. We were somewhere in their 30s. And there was a level of intimacy in that group, not just physically, like, and some of us, we were sleeping with each other. It was all consensual, but it was like friendly. Some of it was platonic, but there was a level of intimacy that was there, and there was a level of connection. And I think that the digital app world has removed a lot of that, where it's all about, it's like transactional. You order a hookup like you order DoorDash now, and you don't even like really connect very much. And so I found, like, I was really interested in Tantra for a while, and the work of like Joseph Kramer and Body Electric, because they were bringing that spirituality into the sexuality, into sex, and bringing the sacred back into sex, which is, has always been sacred. If you go back to our earliest civilization in ancient Sumeria, you had the homoerotic priesthood to Inanna that worked as sacred prostitutes in the temples. So sex has always been sacred, and it's always been a sacred part of queer spirituality. It's always been an expression of queer spirituality. And so I think it's important that we bring that back. I also have been, I'm not very active now in it, but for a number of years, I was very active in the gay leather community, and was a title holder here in Ohio. And, the Venn diagram between pagans and leather men is like almost overlapping circles sometimes. So there's a lot of that in, like, because I think that, in BDSM and leather, people are exploring like the edges of perception, the edges of reality. What is pleasure? What is pain? How can I go further? How can I challenge myself? And then at the same time, like, pagans and people who are looking for mystical experiences are doing a lot of the same things. And so there's a lot of overlap. And so I see spirituality really coming in through that kind of scene as well.
Interesting. I never really put two and two together with that one, but yeah, I could see how that would be the case. You mentioned before Sumerian pantheon and working particularly in that. I'm just curious, how did you get started in that? Why did it resonate with you? And where does one take that, it being essentially the oldest culture, the most ancient culture known to us at this time?
Yeah, so Sumerian culture has fascinated me since I was in art school. So Sumerian art really spoke to me, and there was just something about it that felt familiar to me. So I don't know if it's like a past life thing or what, but it just felt very familiar. The challenges of of working with Sumerian deities and trying to like look at their practices is it's so old that there's not a lot of source material. So a lot of it has to be, unverifiable personal gnosis. So, but the pantheon just really spoke to me. And then when I started to work with one of the occult orders I worked in Albuquerque, they were very grounded in Sumerian mythology, and in particular there was a little bit of like the sort of new age starseed Anunnaki kind of philosophy in their stuff too. So I started learning about the Sumerian myths through that, but they spoke to me on another level, like, they just felt familiar and comfortable. I also find that as the sort of earliest myths, the Sumerian deities are so like primal in a lot of ways, and they're so like human in a lot of ways as well. And so I think that they're very relatable in that way.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Inanna before. Have you worked with her particularly?
Yeah, so Inanna is one that I worked with particularly. So after Between the Worlds for 4 years, I did another gay men's festival called Kafnia, and we had a temple to Inanna there that was basically a temple to pleasure, because Inanna is the goddess of non-marital sex. And a goddess of war and love, and so we had a temple to Inanna that we erected at our festival. That was just really a place for like intimate touch, but not sex. It was like a place for people to just like spend some time giving each other pleasure, like focusing on what feels good to me. How do I want to connect with this person in a way that maybe isn't all about like us just immediately getting off?
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's so important, and I kind of wanted to circle back around to sacred sexuality and intimacy and all of that, because I think it's so very missing, especially in modern hookup culture. Everything is transactional, like you said, and there just seems to be this connection, this intimacy that's completely lost, and people don't know how to express that, especially the younger generation, it seems. For me, it was almost like, I grew up in the raver culture in like the 90s and early 2000s or whatever, and we would have cuddle puddles. Yes, we were all on drugs at the time, but dissolving boundaries, that's what it was all about. And suddenly, you could just have that intimacy and that touch and that exchange of energy, and it didn't matter. Next morning, of course, you're all hungover and nobody's your best friend anymore. And so, but still you have that experience, like how do you carry that over into our everyday lives, into the regular world, especially in a transactional hookup culture? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I came out in the late 80s and early 90s, and there was a lot of that same sort of like intimacy, and we all always kind of ran in groups, and it was for safety back then. It was the height of the AIDS epidemic. There was still gay bashing happening, so we went out in groups because that's how we stayed safe. That's how we looked out for each other. And so there was a level of intimacy that just comes from going out with the same group of people all the time, spending time with them, having each other's back, caring for each other the way that we did. And I think that in a lot of ways, it's great that we have moved past the AIDS epidemic. It's great that we've, science has given us drugs that take care of, allow people to live a full life with HIV. But we've lost something in the process, because that really taught us how to take care of each other. And it also taught us how to organize and advocate for ourselves. Which ACT UP and all of those movements that came out of that were instrumental in us winning a lot of the rights that we enjoy today. And I think that, as those of us that were alive in that era and were involved in some of those things, and there are people even older than me, I was a teen and in college during that time, as we're getting older, like a lot of that's being lost. And of course, with our rights under attack now, we really need to make sure that the next generation is empowered and enabled to carry that fight.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important issue. I do want to get back to that. I usually don't take questions in the middle of the interview, but I realized that I have to go find my computer charger. So, Miguel, you had your hand up, so I'm just going to let y'all talk for just a couple minutes, and I'm going to go grab something downstairs real quick.
Okay, it's okay.
Go ahead, Miguel.
Well, I wanted to mention something because something that you said, Julian, catch my attention. So around 2015, I went to a event because there was a woman here in Venezuela that she developed a technique that in English would be translated as sexual energy activation technique. I remember she spoke about these sacred prostitutes that they work in temples, but it wasn't Sumerian. I think they were Greek or Roman. I don't remember quite well. But what I do remember is that she opened my eyes to this relationship between spirituality and sex, because the work we did there moved a lot of things. And I remember that when I went to the therapy that she developed, the person that, because it's like a message, a body message, but it's not sexual. But the person that does the message to you moves, or this is the theory is that they move the energy from the first chakra to the top. And I remember that it's also blending with the Chinese meridians, because they touch you in some specific places. And for me, it was one of the most powerful experiences I had, because she touched me like here, and I felt the current inside my body to my big toe in the contrary feet. So I felt my nerves inside. For example, she touched me like here, and the thing did here. Incredible. But the most stunning thing, or most impressive thing, is that I saw memories, like persons I know, and I also saw a lot of people I don't know, a lot of persons. So it was a very interesting experience for me. And what you're saying about Inanna also is catching my attention, because I didn't know Sumerian people also had that.
Yeah. So, sacred sexuality has been part of a lot of cultures. The Taoists have massage techniques, which is where body electric here in the US comes from, is sort of this idea of some of the Taoist techniques. There's Tantra. But the Sumerians, Inanna in particular, had a priesthood of men who would dress in women's clothes and would serve as prostitutes in her temples. So they were very likely the first queer priesthood, the first priesthood of gay men.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so it sounds like that's a really the technique that you experienced was very similar maybe to body electric, although body electric does focus more on genital massage with the idea of like pulling, like they're raising the energy there, but then you're using this breathing technique to pull the energy up through your body. And then they do this thing at the end called the big draw, where you tense all your muscles, and then you like just relax and kind of go on this. It's sort of like almost like a little journey. Yeah.
I don't know exactly how to explain it, but I know it's like, imagine you have light bulbs in your body, and it's the energy of the other person, because for some reason you can do it yourself, because I have done it. I learned some techniques with them, and I have touched myself in certain places, and I can see things if I do it. But it just works different when the energy of other person passes through you, because this memory seems to activate.
Yeah. And that's an important concept that we talk about in human design, is the way that our energy conditions each other. So, we each have an energetic blueprint, and there's different parts of our blueprint that aren't natively activated, but when we're in the energy of people who have the other pieces of that blueprint, it activates our energy and allows it to flow in a different way. And so obviously, these kind of techniques and intimacy, and that allows us those opportunities to experience that other energy and have those activations.
Okay.
I think that's an important thing to get across. You know, sometimes like as a solitary practitioner myself, everything is in my ritual space. Everything is in my body. Everything is within. And so sometimes I've gotten to that, well, I don't need anybody else to heal me. You know, I don't need to work with anyone else. I don't need to do the group stuff. I don't need to do that. And yet every time I do, it ends up unlocking something that I've been working on for years. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I do benefit from, you know, having intimacy with other people. Having other people's energy move through you can also be a very powerful experience and very valuable, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Group work is really important. And, you know, one of the great things about having been involved with Between the Worlds for 10 years was that we had a gay male grove that was basically the group behind it. And so Michael and I founded it and we were the facilitators, but we had the support of our grove, and we met, you know, 8 times a year for the Sabbats. Some of us like were co-housing in Columbus together. So there was this level of like familiarity and intimacy that came from the fact that we were doing ritual together. We were living in the same space, and then we were running this festival together. And I think that's one of the things that has shifted the energy and the focus of the festival so much now that, you know, we've stepped back from it. You know, the Grove has moved on. They've brought other people in. There's not the same level of connection between the people behind it. And then I also just think that some of the people that are involved in it have different ideas about what they want the festival to be.
Right. Yeah, that always happens. I think with the more people you get involved in something, the more it changes. If it changes hands, the whole energy and purpose behind it shifts. You know, I think of groups like the Radical Fairies, you know, and how instrumental they were and that kind of stuff, and what they still do in Tennessee and whatnot. And the Radical Fairies group, not to knock anybody or whatever, but the Radical Fairies group in Denver, like, would have coffee on Sundays, and that was it. You know, so it's like a totally different vibe, totally different purpose. You know.
Because these communities and these festivals, they grow out of the vision of the founders, and you know, and while you can get people to be passionate about your vision, they're never going to see the vision the same way you do. So when you leave, you know, as a founder, the vision starts to shift, because now you're no longer anchoring the vision of the community and the festival. Other people are trying to implement what they understand of your vision, and of course, it's going to shift.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to circle back around to queer activism, because especially with the climate today, what's happening, and a lot of our rights being taken away and all of that. I see a lot of people wanting to get involved, needing to get involved, or they feel that pull towards it. And yet sometimes I find that, especially the whole political environment, political thing, and activism in general tends to be anti-spiritual in a way. And so I'm wondering how we justify that as queer spiritual people, when all of the traditions are telling us not to get upset, not to get angry, to have, you know, less of a push out there and shaking things up in the external world and going within and retreating and getting away from the world and that kind of thing. And yet we still feel this pull to do something for our communities, you know, maybe the idea of a silent protest or whatever. Could you speak to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I think first of all, as spiritual people, like, this whole idea that we shouldn't be involved in politics, or we shouldn't be involved in protest or activism, I think it's misguided. And the reason is that if we're truly spiritual, you know, if we really believe the core message of most religions, it's that we're all one. And so when we see injustice, when we see people being treated as less than, that should incite sacred anger, like holy anger, right? Mm-hmm. There's this concept of holy rage. And, you know, I'm someone who has worked with a lot of war deities over my work as a hard polytheist. You know, I talked about being a hard polytheist early on. You know, I've worked with Inanna, who's a war goddess. You know, I've worked with Prometheus and Enalios, which are, you know, Greek deities. Enalios is a name for Ares, so another war deity. When I did heavy oracular work. I experienced, Odin several times. So I have that tendency to like vibe with the war deities a little bit, which makes me want to just kind of like go all out on some of this stuff. But I think that, we have to realize that everyone has this inherent worthiness. Everyone deserves to have freedom to explore their path as they see fit, freedom to live their life as they see fit. I'm a Thelemite, I worked with the OTO, and I believe in, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will, which means that everyone has the ability to do their divine will and should not be impeded by other people in doing that. And so I think that activism and fighting for that is actually an expression of my spirituality when I say it is my divine will to fight for this person's ability to live their divine will. So I think that that's really important. Yeah. So yeah. I could go on more, but I'll leave it there.
No, I think you bring up some really good points. JP put it in the chat. He said, for me, it depends on the energy behind it. Are you fighting against or fighting for? You're fighting for something, then you're fighting for people's divine will. That can be a spiritual act. There's also the concept of the spiritual warrior, and you're not just doing it for yourself. You might be doing it for your tribe. The queer community is our tribe, and so that can be a very holy thing. I've worked with spirit.
I agree.
I
agree. I think it's important too that activism looks like different things for different people. So a while ago on my Queer Spirituality podcast, I had Morpheus Ravina on, who's a Llewellyn author, Celtic priestess, and they talked about activism. They talk a lot about spiritual activism, and there's different levels of activism too. There's the spiritual warriors who are in the front lines, like fighting for the cause, and then there's there's a whole village behind that are the people that enable them to do that. The ones that are fixing food to feed everyone after a march. They're the ones that are bailing people out of jail, that are making sure that everyone's got a couch to crash on. There's all different levels of activism. And honestly, living your fullest life as an out and gay person, being in community with each other, that in itself is an act of rebellion in our world today. And so I think that, there's this idea, I always get disturbed when I talk to young gay men, because I hear this idea that they don't need gay community because gays are accepted in the mainstream today and they don't have to have their own community. And that always worries me because I feel like, we're giving up part of what, we fought to have our place and to create our spaces, and we need to hold that line, because the more we allow it to be blended into the mainstream, the easier it is for people to erase us.
Wow, that's a really poignant point. Thank you for that. Miguel brought up another one in the chat. He thinks the best way queer people can do some type of change is through social work. Trans communities in Brazil put the Catholic Church in difficulty because they were feeding the poor children and giving them education. So people started to question, what was the role of the church? Hallelujah. I love that.
Yeah. We've got a food bank here in Dayton, Ohio called Have a Gay Day that runs one of the biggest food banks in the city. So, absolutely. There's lots of ways that we can be visible and do activism without necessarily throwing bricks.
Right. One other thing that came up for me in this whole conversation is the spirituality behind righteous anger, sacred anger, that kind of thing. It came up a lot for me when I first started doing energy healing and whatnot. I was one of those light language people, that started coming through for me in the different meditations and whatnot that I would do. And so I would do activations and healings for people. That pretty much attracted all of the New Agers, and that's what I was sort of lumped into. And of course, my opinion, the New Age has become very toxically positive, overly positive in the last 20, 30 years, maybe. And there's this constant focus on everything's good all the time, boys. And it just does not seem to be very beneficial to me. And So I would have a lot of people protest because I would do activations and healings from like Kali and Pele and different goddesses like that, who were also associated with death and destruction or war, like you mentioned, in Nana and that kind of thing. And people would be like, well, why would you want to just like, you know, vibe with death and like death programs and stuff like that? I would be like, this is an expression of spirit. I'm not saying death as in killing or whatever necessarily. She represents the death of the ego. They tend to focus on the mother god as this aspect of just like divine femininity and like everything's fine and yin and all of that all the time. But if you look at all of the traditions, the mother goddess is also a heinous bitch, you know, who will cut your head off and swallow you whole in the earth with divine fire if you are not doing things in alignment with spirit, you know. And so that is an I don't know, you could probably speak to that too.
Yeah, so we've gotten so obsessed with the binary in our culture, right? And so like we've got the white lighters that are like, it's all about love and white light, and you know, and if you look at nature itself, right? So supposedly paganism, Wicca is a nature religion. Nature is pretty ambivalent. It's not all good, it's not all bad, you know. There's tornadoes and there's really nice sunny warm days. You know, and you need both. You absolutely have to have both. And toxic positivity, like it's a real issue in the New Age movement. You know, I understand the idea that our thoughts create our reality, but that doesn't mean that we deny anger or disappointment or any of those negative thoughts or emotions that happen. You know, we don't want to be all negative all the time either, but it's not healthy to deny what we're feeling in the interest of, you know, just suppressing our feelings so that we can try to manifest some positive ideal world. You know, we live in this our incarnation in order to learn, and the way we learn is through challenges. And so there needs to be those challenges. If everything was easy and white light and happy and sunshine and rainbows every day, what would we actually be learning? What would our soul be gaining from experiencing that? And you know, and I think that's an important part that spiritual people need to think about. You know, I see the goddess as both sides. You know, she's good and evil. And the whole point is that she maintains that balance, because that balance is what's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Some of the deities that I've worked with or spirits in the past, again, in like the Taoist and Buddhist tradition, it doesn't come up in Taoism so much, but Fudo Myo, and he's, you know, angry Buddhist deity, and he's got like fangs, and he's holding a sword, and he's got flames coming out, and he has a chain so that he can like chain your demons and that kind of thing. And people get so turned off by that these days, just like any kind of like fierce imagery or whatever in, you know, because Buddhism is just supposed to be all and like Zen. But it's not. It's really not. There's all kinds of spirits that they work with and whatnot. And for me, the whole phrase that always stuck with me when it comes to that is, he is angry for enlightenment. So it's just sort of like what JP was saying. It's like, are you getting angry for a spiritual reason? That can be a sacred form of anger, and it can do a lot of good in the world, you know?
Right. And I think, so there's an author and famous occultist, Lon Milo Ducat, and a long time ago he was talking about, you know, the practice of summoning spirit, of conjuring spirits. You know, there's the whole thing in occultism of like the Goetia and conjuring demons to do your work, or conjuring angels to do your work. And someone asked him, well, isn't it all in your head? And his response was, yes, but you have no idea how large your head is. So, and I think that, you know, when we think about like that, we really have to think about there's different purposes for all of this. You know, there's energy is just energy. It's the intention that we put behind it. And oftentimes, you know, the demons are our own, and part of our process, or part of what we're here to learn, is how do we conquer our demons.
Yes. Cheers to that, I say. I wanted to talk a little bit about the lemma, just to wrap up. I think you also work in that vein, and the OTO. I will make absolutely, I have no qualms about saying I have never been a fan of Crowley as a person.
Yeah.
As a person, but I am a fan of Thelema. Can you talk about the sort of justification between that? I've also had bad experiences with personal teachers, who ended up doing very bad things. That does not mean that their teachings were all wrong, were all bad, and that kind of thing.
Well, the first thing I would say is that occultism as a whole is full of egotists. There's big egos, even though the goal of a lot of occult work is the death of the ego. That's often easier said than done, and there are sometimes some very large egos involved in that kind of work. Crowley is someone who I think undeservedly has a bad reputation in a lot of ways. Was he problematic? Yes, in a lot of ways. He was pretty sexist. He was a drug fiend, and a pathological liar. But he also lived during the Victorian era where people went out of their way to try to keep this surface level acceptability to everything. And so a lot of what he was doing and saying was intentionally outrageous in order to sort of shock people out of their complacency a little bit, to make them think. And I think that we need those kinds of personalities in every era, because we do fall into groupthink pretty easily. I mean, just look at social media. It's so driven by the algorithm. Everyone is copying whatever it takes to feed the algorithm, not really being original or creative. And so I think we need people like Crowley in every era to kind of shock us out of that and make us think a little more deeply. And that's really what a lot of what Crowley was trying to do, was really get people to stop being so damn polite and really think about some of this stuff. But Thelema is, the concept behind Thelema is that in 1904, Crowley channeled a book called the Book of the Law. It's 3 chapters long. And the core basis of Thelema is that there have been 3 ages of humankind. The first aeon was the aeon of Isis, which was typified by peaceful matriarchal societies. Then we moved into the aeon of Osiris, which was the patriarchy and the very warlike aeon. And now we're in the aeon of Horus, which is the androgynous child. So it's an era of individual responsibility, an era of androgyny, an era of permissiveness. So one of the phrases I love from the Book of the Law is the word of sin is restriction. And it's all about that there's no restrictions, that, dogma and rules are not how you become moral. You become moral by doing the spiritual work to develop your own moral compass and tune into your own divine will. And so Thelema is about doing that what we call the great work, which is to really be in tune with your higher self in a way that you are exercising your divine will, and that you're not in that interfering with other people's divine will, that you're not making it impossible for them to do the same. And so it's really a philosophy of individual responsibility, of doing the necessary work to develop your own moral compass, and permissiveness, all the things that were labeled as sin or forbidden just for arbitrary reasons aren't necessarily bad. And so Thelema is, if it's right for you, it's right for you. And it kind of takes that approach.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you for that clarification. I sort of think of Crowley as one of the original punk rockers, just kind of
yeah,
shaking stuff up just to shake stuff up and show people how ridiculous they are. In a spiritual sense, he sort of resonates to me with the Heyoka tradition in the Native American tradition, who were the sacred clowns, the ones who would whoop and holler. All of the elders were sitting in a circle doing drumming and chanting and having this very sacred, staid ritual or whatever. And they would, remind everybody that it's also farce,
Yeah.
That kind of thing, So yeah, I do love that, and I have that little spiritual rebel inside me to this day. I say I'm not a fan of Crowley, and yet my YouTube page to this day is New Aeon Awakening. So
yeah, yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
I'm totally agreeing.
Okay. Is there anything that you wanted to bring up, particularly just from your own consciousness, that you wanted to get out here?
Oh gosh, I just think we're in an era where we really need to do the work to refocus on on gay community. Gay men we need that intimacy and connection. We need to, we've got so much has moved online that like gay bars are closing, and were bars really ever the greatest place for us to gather? You know,
Nope.
it led to a lot of people having issues with addiction and things. So maybe we need an alternative to that, but we need to carve out those spaces for ourselves. We need to support those spaces when people create them. You know, if people are hosting festivals or doing calls like this, you know, we need to support those because we need our community. You know, blending into the mainstream makes it easier for us to be erased. It makes it easier for people to say, oh, well, that's okay, just don't talk about it, which, you know, we lived with for a long, long time. And that time has passed. And in the new aeon, we should be embracing who we are, and we should be building community around that authentic expression of who we are. And so I think that, you know, that aspect of community is really important, and it really comes down to three levels that we have to start building community. First of all, there's the individual level. Are you really ready for community, and are you the type of person who can be in community? You know, are you harboring residual shame that you project onto other gay men? Are you harboring bitterness about the way some gay men treated you in the past? You know, we have to do the work to be ready to be in community. Then we need to build our tribe. You know, each of us should have that like friend group, that tribe, that closer knit community that we work with, and we have to build those back up first. And then from that, we can take everything to the collective. We can bring all that magic that we're creating in our tribes to the larger gay community. And then from the larger gay community, as we start to elevate the consciousness there, we can create a bigger table that includes more people, and brings our magic to the wider collective. So I think that's really important. I think that older gay men have a huge role to play in this because we remember those communities. We experienced them when we were younger, and you know, a lot of us miss them, but we remember what they were like. And so there's a huge role for us to play as mentors to kind of show the way here. And so it's really important that those of us who are older get over ourselves a little bit. You know, we're so obsessed with, I'm getting older, I'm not attractive anymore, I'm not this, you know, young people don't want to hang out with me. There's just older gay men sometimes bring a lot of baggage and they get in their own way. And I think that really now is the time for us to do that inner work, to really step into our power and step into the shoes of being those mentors to help our gay community come together, especially, you know, in what's right now a pretty troubling time for our country.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Hear, hear. Okay, well, thank you so much for that. I'm just going to go ahead and see if anybody has any questions to ask of you specifically. Miguel, Jeff, Mark, anybody who wants to chime in. If not, we can go ahead and sign off after that. And yeah, I just want to thank you for being here. Thank you for lending your voice to this call, to the community in general. I forgot to say it before, but I'm doing this in partnership with the Orange Dragonfly Society. We do have one call, I think, that is specifically queer oriented. This one is just for the boys. So trying to make a space for that as well. And all types of queer men, including trans men, bi, questioning, whatever. So just wanted to get that in there. And yeah, I think it is incredibly important at this point. You know, I don't know if I've reached elder status at this point, but I am 43, you know, so I'm definitely over the gill, at least the false one that we've all created for ourselves in our youth. And so I can lend my own, if I have any little sprinkling of wisdom, I can put that in there, you know, and I think it's very important for us to create these spaces and to speak out and to, you know, help support each other, especially when, you know, it comes to like everything is out there on social media. And so we're so much more connected and yet we're more disconnected than ever. You know, it just seems very important to get together and talk about this stuff. So again, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. And, you know, yeah, I turned 55 this year and, you know, I made it past 30 and I didn't diminish and go into the West. So, you know, I'm here doing what I can.
Like Galadriel.
Yeah. But yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun. I love talking about this kind of stuff, and I love, you know, meeting different communities and seeing what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Oh, actually, before I do that, do you have a website or anything that you just want to put out there for people to get in touch with you if they want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is thejuliancrossonhill.com.
Is there a hyphen in Crosson-Hill?
Nope, it's all one word for the web address. Yep.
All right, I'm putting it in the chat just to put it on the record.
Yeah, and I'm on Instagram, but I post very infrequently. I'm pretty active on Blue Sky. You know, I use the Julian Crosson-Hill on them, so you know you can find me out there. I'm also on Mastodon. In fact, I run the queerspirituality.social Mastodon instance. So,
okay. I might have to get back on that. I know a lot of people in our community are getting away from meta in general, so that's always good to know. Okay.